Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel and thank you for joining me for another true crime deep dive. This is the third and final part of the Dennis Nilsen serial killer series, so if you've not seen the first two parts yet, they're linked in the description box and you should probably watch those first or none of this will make any sense. Now, I don't know how this is gonna look. The video quality when it goes up. I've been having some problems here. I am really bad at technology, and the best thing for me is something that is plug and play. And as we all know, the things that actually make a good quality content are not usually that. They're highly adjustable, personalizable, whatever. And I did something in my camera last week. I did something that I messed something up. So the video was really dark the last time I recorded a video, and now to me, when I'm looking at it, it looks really light. Like this shirt here, this shirt's blue, baby blue, and then this shirt here is white. But they look the same color to me. Now maybe when I plug my memory card in and it uploads to my computer, it will look different, but if it's not looking good, then forgive me. I'm working on it and I will fix it. Probably with the help of somebody who knows what they're doing. But what are you going to do? The show must go on. So in the previous videos, we've discussed Dennis Nilsen's life, his early life, how he got started on, being a murderer. We talked about his arrival in London and the beginning of his years-long killing spree. And today we are going to follow Dennis Nilsen as he leaves behind the flat whose four walls had witnessed the brutal murders of several young men who had made the unfortunate mistake of trusting the mild-mannered government employee. But before we dive in, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Magellan TV. Magellan TV is a new kind of documentary streaming service, and it is the place to go to stream some of the best documentary films and series in the world. They already have over 3,000 titles available. They add more every single week, so there's sure to be something for everyone on Magellan TV. Whether you're interested in true crime, history, science, nature, or really anything else, you'll find more than enough to keep you busy watching content that is both entertaining and educational. And I know many of you are already watching Magellan TV. You send me messages, you let me know what you're watching, we talk about it. So many more of you want to give it a try. So today I have a great true crime series that I would like to recommend, and it's called 21st Century Killer. Technology in the 21st century has provided grim opportunities and played a part in numerous murders. This series has 7 episodes in it, including the case of Stephen Port, who used online dating apps to prey on young men. So go check it out. It's a great series. It took me only 2 sittings to get through the whole series because it was really well done, really interesting. It kept me paying attention, which is hard for me because I have a short attention span. I have to be really, really into something to keep my attention. Magellan TV was created and built by documentary filmmakers who share your passion for gripping true stories told right. And you can watch it anytime, anywhere, whether you're on the go, watching from your phone or tablet, or, cozy at home because it's snowing and freezing outside, watching on your smart TV or your computer. You can always pull up Magellan TV and quickly find something you want to watch, and everything streams to you ad-free. I really think you should give Magellan TV a try if you aren't already using it. And right now, with the holidays just around the corner, don't remind me, I'm stressed out because shipping times are crazy and I feel like I have to buy everything right now so that I don't take a chance that something might not get here in time. Anyways, Magellan TV is offering viewers of this channel a special offer. If you buy 1 gift card for an annual membership, you get 1 for free. This is a really, really great deal because there's a lot of value in it. It means you can get Magellan TV for yourself and give it as a gift to someone you love, or if you already have Magellan TV and you love it so much and you want your mom and your dad to watch it, or your dad and your sister, or your dad and your best friend, or your dad and your boyfriend. There's more combinations, but I think you get it. You can get 2 Magellan TV annual subscriptions for the price of 1. So to claim your special offer now, click the link in the description box, get started, and thank you so much to Magellan TV for sponsoring today's video. Let's dive back in. All right, so the year 1981 was a turning point of sorts for Dennis Nilsen. He was mugged one evening as he walked home drunk from the Cricklewood Arms. This was a bar that was kind of close to his flat. The culprits beat him, they stole his shoes and jacket, and he actually had an entire month of wages in the pocket of his jacket. So this obviously put him in like a super uncomfortable financial position. Now, I don't know why you would go to a bar and get drunk while you have like a month's worth of your wages, of your paychecks in your pocket. I think it's kind of a stupid thing to do, but Dennis Nilsen, the bringer of death, the bringer of crime, became a victim of a crime himself. And I don't want to say that I'm glad about it because I don't want anybody to be the victim of a crime, but if somebody has to be, it's okay if it's Dennis Nilsen. It also turned out that his apartment had been broken into twice in just the space of a few months. So the first time his camera and his projection equipment had been stolen, and then the second time his entire flat was ransacked. So whoever had crept into his flat while he'd been at work had smashed his television, his record player, and his precious floor-length mirror. They destroyed his bed, his clothes, his furniture, his records. Everything had been doused in creosote, and they were pretty much unsalvageable. So nothing in that apartment was really able to be saved. Now, I didn't know what creosote was, so I looked it up. And for anyone else who didn't know, creosote is apparently a byproduct of wood combustion that consists mainly of tar. Creosote is actually what gives meat its smoked flavor, and it can be found in smoke that rises from open flames. It's extremely flammable, and it basically just looks like a pile of dirt or like crushed up Oreos. That's what it looks like to me, at least. Now, in my opinion, this doesn't sound like a random attack or a robbery. What happened to Dennis Nilsen's flat sounds like a targeted vendetta, and I have to wonder who did this and why. And that's never been revealed, but I do think that there's more about these robberies, the mugging, the vandalizations that we will probably never know. And maybe Dennis Nilsen had some enemies out there, even before the world knew that he was a serial killer. Because think about it, Nilsen had attacked some people who got away, who he didn't end up killing. And then those people would go to the police, and the police would come back, and they'd be like, oh, we believe Dennis Nilsen, get out of here, kid. And then that was the end of it, basically. So I wonder if those people may have felt some sort of need to get even. Because think about it, his floor-length mirror, his record player, his records, things like that, those were all super important to him, and he would use them sometimes as tools in his attacks. Now, this is completely unfounded. This is completely speculation by me, but let me know in the comments if you think it's possible. Now, this was not the only reason that Dennis Nilsen decided it was time to move out of that flat and move on to a different one, although it would have been enough of a reason for me. Needless to say, Dennis and his landlord, they didn't have the warmest of relationships. Apparently, Nilsen had a problem paying his rent on time, and he wasn't the most cooperative tenant. So the landlord began sort of pushing him to move out so that he could rent the flat to someone for more money who would also pay their rent on time, and Dennis resisted this stubbornly. Now, the attack on his flat and his belongings may have been the landlord trying to accelerate Nilsen's exit. Dennis did call the police after his flat was destroyed, even though he had 4 bodies sitting under the floorboards at that time, 4 bodies that had begun to smell, and he was spraying disinfectant and like room deodorizing spray every single day, trying to keep it under wraps. The police came and investigated, apparently did not smell any dead bodies, but they never found out who had done the crime. Dennis's coworkers at the job center, they actually raised $85 and gave the money to him so he could buy new furniture and get his apartment back in order and replace some of his destroyed belongings. And he actually seemed very touched by this gesture. He wrote them a thank you note written in his normal, flowery, and dramatic way of speaking. And he said, quote, "Dear friends and colleagues, I am humbled by the quiet dignity and unsung qualities of support and encouragement I have received from my colleagues at Denmark Street. A cynic like myself seems to know the price of everything and the value of nothing. It is with a little half-guilt and humility that I gratefully accept this kind gift from fellow coworkers whose personal financial situations are never overly comfortable. It is at times like this that I fail to fully articulate my feelings for your generous and caring response. Emerson, from his Journal of 1836, can express it better than I. Sympathy is a supporting atmosphere, and in it we all unfold easily and well, end quote. So I wanted to mention something that you guys have noticed. I've noticed that you've noticed from the comments, and something that I have seen and is undeniable. No matter what you want to say about Dennis Nilsen, he was a very, very good writer, which is kind of crazy because when he speaks out loud, you don't understand anything he's saying. He has a very heavy accent. He talks fast. I think he's usually drunk when we see him talking, like on film. So it's so strange. It's such a dichotomy to see him in person, hear him talk, and not really understand what he's saying, and then to see his words, which are very articulate and heartfelt, right? Which is crazy because if we're to believe that he's a psychopath, they don't have emotions, they don't feel things like this. But Dennis Nilsen either did or was very good at pretending he understood the human condition. Finally, though, Dennis gave in and decided to leave his flat and all the problems and memories that lived there with him. But first, he needed to have one last bonfire to get rid of the remaining evidence. One by one, he removed the 4 bodies from underneath the floorboards and placed them side by side on the floor. He then began to take the bodies apart piece by piece, and later, as he recollected this moment, he said, quote, "The smell was grossly unpleasant, and in some cases there existed large colonies of maggots. I dissected the bodies and wrapped the parts in white paper kitchen towel rolls, of which I had an adequate supply," end quote. Ugh, large colonies of maggots. But don't get it twisted. Nilsen wasn't too disgusted with the sight of human flesh. In his autobiography, he wrote, quote, "When dissecting the corpses of the first 2 victims at Cranley Gardens, I was able to reflect rationally on the culinary possibilities of fairly fresh human meat. But the thought only engaged me for a few moments. When I sliced through human buttocks, the meat looked just like beef rump steaks, with the color being slightly lighter than in beef. Similarly, the pieces boiled in the pot looked just like boiled beef. The thought of giving a small chunk to Bleep crossed my mind, but I didn't want her to acquire a taste for human flesh. Finally, and perhaps insultingly to those I'd killed, I wasn't sure of the purity of their meat. In total, and also on moral grounds, I didn't think their flesh was suitable or fit for human consumption." End quote. He's a Rubik's Cube, man. He's a Rubik's Cube because he seems self-aware. He seems self-aware that even the thought crossing his mind that the meat of his victims wasn't fit for a human to eat, much less his dog, would be kind of insulting to his victims, to the people he'd killed. He was aware of this. And he says he only thought about this for a few moments, but in my opinion, it sounds like he actually put a lot of thought into it. Nilsen also said that he may have considered keeping some body parts from his victims if he'd had a chemical for preservation. He remembered that the hands of one of his victims had been very pretty and small and marble white, and he would have liked to have kept them in a jar. He said he also would probably have done this with all the scrotums and penises of his victims if only he'd had that chemical for preservation. Self-aware, but still a full-ass banana split with extra nuts. 2 days before he moved out, Nilsen built a large bonfire in the back garden early in the morning, a fire fueled by his creosote-soaked furniture and belongings. And he said, quote, "The fire burned fiercely, extraordinarily fiercely. There were spurts, bangs, cracks, hisses, a continual hissing and sizzling coming from the fire. This was what I took to be fat and other parts of the bodies burning," end quote. When Dennis Nilsen drove away from 195 Melrose on October 5th, 1981, he felt a great sense of relief, and he headed towards his new home, 23 Cranley Gardens, in the desirable London neighborhood of Muswell Hill. But of course, someone like Dennis Nilsen can't drive away from his problems. Actually, none of us can, right? Because usually the problem is internal, and it follows us no matter how fast or how far we run. Dennis Nilsen found himself faced with a whole new set of problems when he moved into his next flat, which was located on the top floor of the old building. So essentially, he was living in this big house's attic, and thus there were no floorboards to lift, no floorboards to hide bodies under. He also didn't have access to a nice big garden like the one he'd had at Melrose, so there was literally no place to hide. So for a while, Dennis behaved himself, and as far as we know, there was a several-month gap in his murders during which he spoke to his mother, Betty, on the phone for the first time in years. Now, as I had mentioned in part 1, Dennis claims his mother was a cold, mean woman who never wanted him, never loved him, and was happy to be rid of him when he left for the army. But police would later discover evidence that this was not really the case at all. Betty White sent Dennis a card on his birthday and at Christmas time every year, cards he never responded to. Betty would tell Dennis about what was going on with her, with his stepfather Adam, and his siblings that were Betty and Adam's kids, and she would ask him how he was doing. Had he met anyone special? Did he ever think he was going to settle down and start a family? The typical mother stuff that can feel very intrusive, but usually comes from a good place. So she was contacting him. She was trying to connect with him. She was trying to keep whatever connection they had going, and he was not having it. Nilsen would later tell law enforcement that he never knew when he was going to kill, and he wasn't even sure what triggered him to do it. But according to Brian Masters, author of the book Killing for Company, Nilsen could never tell when another murder would occur. When speaking about Nilsen's state of mind, Masters said, quote, "He naively and desperately hoped that the latest would remain the last. He claimed that he never went out pub crawling to look for a victim. What he did do was go out and look for company, and it's important to remember that there were more people who accompanied him back to his flat and were left unharmed than there were those who died. I could never beforehand make a deliberate choice to kill," he says. End quote. I'm not sure if this is supposed to make us feel better about those innocent people that Nilsen did kill, because it doesn't. It doesn't make me feel better, but it is interesting when asking the question of what exactly Dennis Nilsen's triggers were. What exactly led him to that ultimate act of murder? It does make sense that when Dennis moved, he may have felt that he was leaving his murderous impulses behind, and that choosing to live in the attic apartment had been purposeful to discourage him from killing again. He did make mention later to the police that he would sometimes do things or put himself in positions that would make it harder for him to kill people. Whether or not that's true or just his narrative, I don't know. But one evening in December of 1981, Nilsen stumbled upon a young man named Kevin Sylvester who was lying in the street drunk and barely able to move. Now, normally this would have been the ideal victim, since we know that Dennis Nilsen loved them unconscious. But instead of killing Sylvester, Nilsen brought him home. He put him to bed on his stomach so that if Kevin Sylvester threw up, he wouldn't choke on his vomit. And the next morning, he fed Kevin breakfast and saw him safely home. Now, Nilsen patted himself on the back for not killing Kevin Sylvester. He said he felt elated and happy because he had not lost control, and the past was truly in the past. But turns out the past was not in the past, and 4 months later, Dennis Nilsen would go full circle. Carl Stoddard was 21 years old and drunk when he met Dennis Nilsen in March of 1982 at the Black Cap Bar in Camden, North London. Carl was in a state of distress. He had come out to his parents when he was 15, and he'd been told by his father that he was basically dead to them. Carl was homeless, living in various hostels. He was a gay man who liked to dress in drag, something that was not super accepted at this time and in this place. And he told Dennis that he pretty much just wanted to die. Dennis brought him home to 23 Cranley Gardens, where he choked him with the cord from a sleeping bag. Carl passed out, but he wasn't dead, and he came to only to find that his head was being held underwater in the bathtub as Nilsen tried to drown him.
I fell asleep, and I woke up and he was strangling me. And I passed out after sort of thinking. I thought that I'd got caught up in the sleeping bag, which he had warned me about, and I thought he was helping me out, but he wasn't. And anyway, I passed out from that, and I remember vaguely hearing water running and being carried, and I felt very cold, and I realised I was in the bath and he was trying to drown me.
Now, Carl Stoddard is not the only known person to have survived an attack by Dennis Nilsen, but he was pretty vocal about it afterwards. And it's often reported that maybe Nilsen had a change of heart and revived Carl, giving him mouth to mouth and wrapping him in blankets and then putting him in front of the heater so he would sort of warm up and come to. Now, when Carl woke up, he was in a subway station with no recollection of how he had gotten there. In the end, Carl's testimony would help convict Nilsen, but he never recovered from this very traumatic experience, and he was haunted for the rest of his life, wondering if Nilsen had been his murderer or his savior. It's kind of like a Stockholm Syndrome thing. He wondered, why was I allowed to live when so many others were not? He felt a form of survivor's guilt, and Carl battled his demons and eventually drank himself to death in January of 2013 at the age of 52. Now, Carl's sister, her name's Julie Bentley, she claims that Dennis Nilsen murdered her brother in the end and destroyed their entire family. She said, quote, "Nilsen may not have killed his body that night, but he killed the Carl I knew and idolized as a child. He ended up in a worse hell than Nilsen and a prison of his own," end quote. Now, according to Dennis himself, though, he says he never planned to kill Carl. He said he had used his passive body as a prop for his fantasies. And Nilsen said, quote, "When I revived him, it wasn't so much a change of heart, but an accident of luck and circumstances," end quote. Basically, Dennis claims that while he was holding Carl underwater, Carl had an unconscious bodily reaction that sometimes people will have when they are on the verge of death. Your body does things unconsciously. You can release, excrement, you can pee yourself. You can also do other things that have to do with that area of the body. And apparently this normal bodily reaction ruined Dennis Nilsen's fantasy. So Dennis just pulled him out of the bathtub and put him to bed. But personally, I don't really think I believe Dennis Nilsen. I think he really did try to kill Carl. But this was his first attempted murder in that new flat, and he may have been worried about where he was going to keep the body or how he was going to dispose of it, and he hadn't been there long enough to come up with an actual plan. I believe this because Dennis Nilsen went on to murder 3 different men after this. The first murder took place the same month that Carl Stoddard had barely escaped with his life. And yes, I also think you can make the argument that a lot of guys went to Dennis Nilsen's flat and they didn't die. But that wasn't after he had choked them and then put their head underwater. So it looks like Nilsen was going through the motions of his usual, pre-murder routine or during the murder routine. He was in the bathroom, and after that he would do the post-murder routine of bathing and redressing and all that stuff. So I don't see why he would have had a change of heart just out of the goodness of his heart. I think it was more like, this is my first time. Where am I going to put this guy? I really don't know yet. Let me wait. Let me formulate an actual workable plan and then find somebody else. Because obviously Nilsen didn't intend for Carl to wake up after he had already put his head underwater, right? This isn't just a fun game that you play, like strangle someone till they pass out and then drown them. Maybe they'll wake up, maybe they won't. Fun game. But what would Nilsen do when he killed people in this new flat? Well, the way that Nilsen disposed of these bodies without having a garden to make a bonfire in or without having floorboards to hide them under was by storing them in a closet until they began to decompose, and then he dissected the bodies into small 2-inch pieces on a wooden cutting board that stretched over the bathtub. He then flushed the pieces of flesh down the toilet, the smaller pieces of flesh, because he was cutting them really small. But this was a slow process, and it was taking too long, so he began to boil larger pieces of flesh in a pot on his kitchen stove. He threw the bones into the garbage, and larger bones were simply tossed over a fence in his backyard. With one victim, Nilsen simply placed the body into his bathtub with cold water, and then he would replace the cold water with fresh cold water every day when he returned home from work. But once that had run its course, obviously cold water can only keep a body preserved for so long, Nilsen would then follow the same procedure of cutting, boiling, flushing. Dennis Nilsen's last known victim was 20-year-old Stephen Sinclair on January 26, 1983. In his autobiography, Nilsen said, quote, "We had both had a few drinks, and he was a bit incoherent. It was clear he was immersed in a drugged lifestyle, famished of social rectitude. With his blonde hair, youthful looks, t-shirt, black leather jacket, and very tight-fitting jeans. I thrilled at the prospect of having him as a sexual partner, and as the evening began to fade, we took the Northern Line Underground train to my flat at Cranley Gardens. We rode in a half-empty carriage, sitting opposite one another, our respective clothing standing out in stark contrast. I was wearing my gray tweed jacket, pale blue shirt, tie, dark trousers, and brown slip-on boots. The casual observer would have never known that we were even together." End quote. Dennis noticed that Stephen Sinclair had certainly been drinking, but he was also under the influence of something else, possibly pills. Stephen was quiet, he didn't say much, but Nilsen was enthralled just to be in his presence, and he watched as his guest sat next to him on the sofa in front of a blazing fire, his blue eyes growing heavier and heavier, and his head sinking down under the weight of exhaustion. Dennis Nilsen said that Stephen Sinclair died without so much as a whimper, and afterwards he removed his clothing, bathed him, redressed him in only his leather jacket, and propped him up in an armchair in the living room. Dennis spent several days with the body of Stephen Sinclair, studying his features, playing with his soft blonde hair. He said he looked at him and felt that he was better off this way, and that killing him had been a mercy. Later, Nilsen would say, quote, "How can you feel remorse for taking his pains into yourself? I loved him much more than anyone else he had ever met in his 20 years. The image of the sleeping Stephen is and will be with me for the rest of my life. No court or person can ever take that from me, or this almost holy feeling. Stephen had to die to get attention for his plight. I would give anything for him to walk into my cell now, alive and warm, and shoot me dead, but then only to return to the junked-up slow twilight of his misery. The moment we met, we were both long ruined. All the pious aftercare comes now. It is too late. A fatal trio, 2 men and a dog, sitting through the mad moments. Stephen got temporary release from the needles, and I from the bottle, but it couldn't last. The Spartan reality of a cold new day would almost certainly have led him to stealing for dope, and me killing for company." End quote. Well, that is a whole another level of mental gymnastics somebody has to do in order to justify the murder of an innocent person. If you were saving him, then why not release yourself from the slow twilight of misery? If you and Stephen were not that different at all, why save him from this horrible life, but you willingly remain in it? You get to stay in it, but Stephen, you thought that he wanted to leave it? 9 days after Stephen Sinclair's murder, Nilsen wrote a letter of complaint to an estate agent. He complained that the drains in his building were blocked. Enter plumber Michael Catran and his horrific journey down the manhole where he found chunks of human flesh. Now, Dennis Nilsen has told the world that he considers the day he was arrested as the day that help arrived. He had wanted to be caught and arrested because he needed to be saved from himself, and he needed others to be saved from him. What? That doesn't make sense, because you said you were saving the people. You were saving Stephen Sinclair. Why do they need to be saved from you? This great vigilante, this Batman, throwing the bat signal in the sky. All you poor wretches, you helpless individuals, come to my flat, and I will save you by killing you, by strangling you with my tie, and then drowning you in my bathtub, and then cutting you up and putting you under my floorboards or in my closet. That's how I save you from the slow death of twilight or whatever the hell he said. So is Nilsen saying that he felt the day he was arrested was the day that saved him and everybody else? Is it true? Well, we'll never really know for sure, but let's look at the evidence that supports or detracts from that assertion. I like to consider myself a fair person. I like to think that I look at both sides, and I suppose that flushing body parts down the toilet and then making a fuss about how your pipes are clogged is certainly counterproductive to not getting caught, right? So I guess we could look at it and say Dennis Nilsen knows he's flushing body parts down the toilet. You think he would know that the toilet connects to the plumbing and the pipes, and then him complaining about it to make somebody go there might have been him either knowingly or unconsciously wanting to be caught. But we also have the fact that Nilsen did go outside and get rid of some of that evidence after Michael Catran left. So that would tell us he was trying not to get caught. And he stood next to Michael Catran when Michael Catran was like, oh, I found this like flesh. I think it's human flesh. And Nilsen was like, probably somebody just eating their KFC and flushing it down the toilet. He didn't look at Michael Catran and say, dude, yeah, that is body parts. That was me. I killed people and flushed them down the toilet. Take me in. But maybe his psyche was so fractured at this point that he was literally battling himself internally. Now, on February 9th, 1983, Dennis Nilsen returned home from work to find 3 detectives there, including Detective Inspector Peter J. The cops told Nilsen that they were there because of the blocked drains, which, as it turned out, were being blocked by human remains. Dennis acted shocked, and he wondered out loud, what? Human remains? Where do you think these human body parts have come from? And he was informed that the police had investigated and realized that they could only have come from his attic apartment. So Dennis unlocked the door to his flat, and he allowed the 3 men to enter. Upon stepping over the threshold, Peter J. claims he was immediately struck by a bad smell, which was not as surprising to him as what happened next. Essentially, Dennis Nilsen was like, yeah, there's bodies in here. Like, there's one in the closet. There's a couple bodies in here, so have at it. And then he agreed to go with the police to the station where he would tell them everything about all the people he had killed. Now, in the car on the way to the police station, Dennis was asked, how many bodies are there to find? Like, not just in your apartment, but overall. And he replied, 15 or 16. He couldn't really remember. Dennis Nilsen was held at the station while the investigation began, and law enforcement returned to the apartment where they found 2 plastic bags with body parts inside, and this led them to identify Nilsen's last victim, Stephen Sinclair. One of the bags contained 2 dissected torsos, as well as assorted internal organs. The second held a human skull, almost completely cleaned of flesh, a severed head, and a torso with arms attached, but the hands missing. They also found more body parts in the closet, a chest of drawers, and a tea chest. Now, during his first interview with Inspector J, Nilsen chain-smoked and confessed to everything, and he brought detectives to his previous address on Melrose Avenue to show them where he had set the fires that had eliminated the evidence of his crimes. Police crews began digging, and overall, they uncovered over 1,000 bone fragments buried in that area. Dennis Nilsen also did a lot of writing while behind bars, awaiting trial, and one of his completed works was a love poem dedicated to his final victim, Stephen Sinclair. I will read that poem to you now. I try to smile, despite the vengeance looking at me, covered in your human tomato paste, a man of many parts. I try to forget, even the perfume of your passing lingers on. More problems now, with all your bits and pieces. I try to run, and pinion to this spot, in acres full of you, of dust and bones. I try to weep, with you looming large in my cell. Of problems to the grave I try to unravel enigmas, and each way I turn I'm still holding you. I try to smile, but you're not smiling now. In April, death is dead, and all the new life lives upon our garbled inquest. I think that's going to be the next Taylor Swift song. Except for that human tomato paste line, because I feel like Taylor could definitely come up with something better than that. A week before his trial, as Dennis sat in his cell, writing down his thoughts and arguing with the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other, he scribbled down this sentence. I have judged myself more harshly than any court ever could. We are not dealing with murder here, although I have killed. And this is important, so just try to hold on to that memory of that line, of that sentence. On October 24th, 1983, Dennis Nilsen was presented to the Central Criminal Court at the Old Bailey. The prosecution had the overwhelming physical evidence as well as Nilsen's own complete confession, but Nilsen's defense attorney was going to present evidence that he believed would show his client was not in his right mind at the time of each murder. Therefore, he could not be held responsible and should be charged with manslaughter, not murder. Now, the lawyer's argument is very interesting. Because like I said, he was trying to argue that Dennis wasn't in his right mind at the time of each murder, but that Dennis would go back to being in his right mind between murders. So basically every time he killed somebody, it was this temporary insanity, and then he'd just go back to being a regular guy after that. And then when he killed again, he would just be crazy again. We're going to get to that in a moment, but the greater mystery to me was the question of remorse. Did Dennis Nilsen feel badly about what he had done? In his confession, he described the killing of one victim as being as easy as taking candy from a baby, and he wrote many letters from prison to police officers working his case where he talked about his life, his murders, and his confusion about his own motives for killing. In one of these letters, he said, quote, "There's no disputing the fact that I am a violent killer under certain circumstances. The victim is the dirty platter after the feast, and the washing up is the clinically ordinary task. It would be better if my reason for killing could be clearly defined. For example, robbery, jealousy, hate, revenge, sex, bloodlust, or sadism. But it is none of these. I guess that I may be a creature, a psychopath, who, when in a loss of rationality situation, lapses into temporarily a destructive psychopath, a condition induced by the rapid and heavy ingestion of alcohol." End quote. Nilsen felt that alcohol may have destroyed his feelings of morality, but he also toyed with the theory that he may have actually felt he was helping these poor souls, saying, quote, "It may be the perverted overkill of my need to help people, victims who I decided to release quickly from the slings and arrows of their outrageous fortune, pain, and suffering." End quote. But wait, he had another theory too. Nilsen said, quote, "Or could it be the subconscious outpouring of all the primitive instincts of primeval man? Could it be a case of the individual exaltation in beating the system and a need to beat and confound it time and time again? It amazes me that I have no tears for these victims. I have no tears for myself or those bereaved by my actions." End quote. So it sounds like, from Nilsen's own words, that there wasn't much remorse being felt by him. It seemed that he was more curious about his own inner psyche and motives, as if once again he had been fractured and one half of him was able to examine the other half, like a biology student dissecting a frog. He once told a police officer who accused him of being a predator, quote, "I seek company first and hope everything will be all right," end quote, which gives me the impression that he knew each and every time he met a new companion out at a pub that there was a chance this person would die at his hands later that very same night. Yet he continued to go out, he continued to drink, he continued to make connections and bring men back to his flat. There have been a lot of mental health professionals who have examined Nilsen and his crimes. Many of them spoke to him themselves, and none of them can seem to agree on exactly what was wrong with him, what he was feeling, what his motives were, if he's a good guy or a bad guy or a little bit of both. 2 psychiatrists were called in by the defense during his trial to examine Nilsen and then testify. The first was Dr. James McKeith, and he told the jury that Nilsen suffered from a severe personality disorder, which he couldn't name because it had no name, but it included paranoid, schizoid, hysterical, and sociopathic tendencies. The jury was presented with a letter that Nilsen had written in prison, where he said, quote, "I have felt since my teenage days that I am a creative psychopath," end quote. He claimed that when he was drinking or under extreme pressure or stress, dormant feelings would be released, and he was unable to look back, only forward. He was only able to live in that moment. Nilsen admitted in this letter that he felt he deserved to be punished. On cross-examination, the prosecutor, Alan Green, told Dr. McKeith that Dennis Nilsen showed clear signs of intelligence and self-control. He could be quick-witted, resourceful, cunning, and he had hoodwinked police on multiple occasions, to which McKeith responded, quote, "I think he hoodwinked himself," end quote. The second psychiatrist called by the defense was Dr. Patrick Galway, testifying that Nilsen's murders appeared to have no normal motive and that the killer would cling to normality like a man drowning in nightmares before succumbing to periods of fantasy where he would kill people as if they were objects. Galway stated that he believed Nilsen's personality had started to crumble when he had cut himself off from his family, saying, quote, "He then had a real need for a relationship to hold him together," end quote. But as the years passed and Dennis never found that ride-or-die person who would prop him up, he began to lose hope that he could ever have a normal relationship. Dr. Galloway said that Nilsen may have understood and known intellectually that what he was doing was wrong, but he did not have the emotional recognition of it. He behaved like a machine. Dr. Galloway referred to Nilsen as a cold-blooded killer who was not responsible for his actions. So he's like a robot who wasn't programmed correctly, and then he goes and he just starts killing people, but it's not the robot's fault that he wasn't programmed correctly. Except Dennis Nilsen's not a robot. He's a human being with a real brain, and he wasn't programmed by anybody. Now, do things happen to us all as children as we go through our lives that do in a way program us? Yes. But luckily, we're humans, so we still have not only that trauma and the pre-programming and certain values, morals, etc., that are built into us as we go through our lives, but we have free will, we have free choice. We have the ability to take all of that and say, screw it, and be whoever we want to be. Dr. Galloway agreed with Dr. McKeith that Dennis Nilsen was paranoid and schizoid, and he suffered from a disorder called the false self. Dr. Galloway said, quote, he has an area of his life in which he behaves perfectly normally. Alongside that, he is having to keep at bay these disturbances which are part and parcel of a schizoid and paranoid personality. He's under constant strain between the normal area and the disturbed area. Although they are in equilibrium, it is potentially a very, very unstable one, end quote. Dr. Galloway, potentially a very unstable one, even if we're going with your theory that Dennis Nilsen is always fighting with these impulses, but he's trying to fight them. So that means like there's some good in there, right? Even if we're going with that theory, it's not potentially a very unstable one. It's definitely a very unstable one. If you have any part of yourself or your psyche or your consciousness that wants to kill people and another part of you has to like fight off that killing part, this is a very unstable balance. In fact, I wouldn't even call it a balance at all. In an October 1983 article from The Guardian, we get a deeper understanding of this disorder that allegedly diminished Nilsen's responsibility for his actions. The article says, quote, Dr. James McKeith described Nilsen's lifelong loneliness, his drinking bouts and blackouts, and his obsession with nakedness and unconsciousness, which led him to masturbate by the corpses of his victims as a symbolic goodbye. Nilsen was paranoid and unsure of his own identity and desperate for the attention of others. He adopted a grandiose air, the doctor said, which was apparent in his own account of his feelings about his victims before he killed them. They would sit down, he told Dr. McKeith, and I would talk incessantly like an auctioneer, outpourings about music, politics, Margaret Thatcher, all completely cynical. If they entered into it, they would be okay. If they were sleeping, they would be dead already, if you like. I would think that they didn't care about anything and just struggled along from day to day. I was giving them a chance to live, end quote. All right, so for those of you who didn't catch it, because I had to read it a couple times. What Nilsen told Dr. McKeith is basically like I'd bring people to my apartment and then I would try to engage them in, what I would call non-small talk. And I feel this. I hate small talk. I hate small talk, especially with strangers. If I'm talking to you and I'm spending my time talking to you, I want to talk about some deep stuff. I want to talk about the meaning of life. I want to talk about what the heck's out there in the universe. I want to talk about anthropology and history. I want to talk about some serious stuff because you're not me and you might have some stuff in your brain that I don't know and I want to know it. So I hate small talk. And what Nilsen is saying is he'd bring these guys there and he'd sit them down. And if they couldn't keep up with his cynical blabberings about politics and Margaret Thatcher and unions and, the horrible state of society, if they couldn't keep up or they weren't interested or they fell asleep, he was like, you suck. You're pretty much a waste of space. You can't take part in these intelligent conversations. You don't share my viewpoints, whether it be on politics, religion, or anything else. Therefore, you don't deserve to live. That's what I heard, right? I don't know what they were teaching aspiring psychiatrists back in the 80s, what they were teaching them in school, but to me, what it sounds like is that Nilsen just killed people if he didn't like them being in his echo chamber. If they contradicted what he said, or they were like, nah, I don't agree with that, or they were like, this is not interesting, let's talk about something else. Also, according to Dr. McKeith, Nilsen's loneliness first started with his father, Olav Sr., an unreliable person who drank heavily and who left when Dennis was just 3. After that, Nilsen had become close to his grandfather, Andrew, but then Andrew died, and when his mother, Betty, remarried, Dennis Nilsen resented her for it. So we're actually going to bring up the topic of Andrew White, Dennis Nilsen's grandfather, a little bit more towards the end of this video, but I want to mention that never once during the trial was it brought up that Dennis Nilsen's grandfather molested him. Not by his legal counsel, not by the prosecution, nobody. So obviously the defense brought in 2 mental health experts, 2 psychiatrists to, speak on behalf of Dennis, and then the prosecution brought in an expert as well. Now, Dr. Paul Bowden, the prosecution's expert, disagreed completely that Nilsen was mentally ill and not responsible for his actions because of that. Dr. Bowden said that Dennis killed because he had an overwhelming desire to do so and because he enjoyed the feeling of having power over his victims. Dr. Bowden believed that Nilsen felt wrong and like a criminal because of his sexual orientation, and therefore, quote, by killing, he was able to transfer his feeling of criminality so that it was no longer because of his homosexuality, but because of the fact that he was a murderer, end quote. So basically, Dennis felt bad, felt dirty, felt guilty because he believed he was gay, and he believed that wasn't accepted by society, and society looked at him as something evil and bad and criminal because of it. So he didn't want to feel that way, so he killed people, and that way he was like, I am bad and evil and a criminal, but not because I'm gay, because I'm a murderer. Dr. Bowden claimed to have found no evidence of a withdrawn character, sexual perversion, alcohol abuse, paranoia, or any of the other symptoms the defense experts put forth. I'm not sure if I'm on board for that either, because there's definitely some stuff going there, like definitely alcohol abuse, definitely sexual perversions. All right, we went through some of his fantasies. I didn't put the worst of them in there. There's some sexual perversion there, a lot. I'm going to just say one word, gorilla. Interestingly enough, Dr. Bowden did feel that Nilsen had sympathy and remorse. During a prison interview with Nilsen, Bowden had been pressing him hard for details about a certain murder when he claims Nilsen's eyes filled with tears, and he abruptly got up and walked away, saying he didn't want to talk about it and he was never able to show his feelings. So these were experts from the 1980s, but I'd like to think that in the many years since, we've advanced a bit in our understanding of mental illness and the mind of a murderer, of a serial killer, of a psychopath. Carrie Danes is a criminal psychologist who was contacted by Dennis Nilsen in 2008 after he saw her on a true crime documentary. She's also an incredibly beautiful woman. Am I right? I mean, I'm just saying, she's gorgeous. Carrie Danes says that she wants to help people and create a world where there are less victims, which is great, beautiful and smart. Good for you, Carrie. She has come face to face with some of the world's worst criminals, like the Yorkshire Ripper, Ian Brady, who I hate Ian Brady, and Dennis Nilsen himself. Carrie Danes does not believe that Dennis Nilsen killed because he was lonely. She thinks he did it because he was into necrophilia. She told the Daily Mail, quote, I think to understand Dennis Nilsen, you really have to look at a series of events during his childhood, and he had a very, very abnormal sexual development, end quote. Danes believes Dennis was attracted to the dead bodies of his victims, and being around them made him feel more powerful because he had passive partners that he could pose, wash, and talk to, similar to his dog Bleep, who never asked questions or made him feel out of control or challenged him or contradicted him. She said, quote, he told me that killing was not important to him. In fact, he found it very difficult. What was important to him was the ultimate product he made, which was these dead men, end quote. Carrie Danes has seen a lot in her career, and although she's come across a handful of people that she doesn't believe can be saved, she still does not believe that anyone is evil. Nobody's born evil, and nobody ultimately becomes completely and purely evil. She believes there's shades of gray, and just because someone has done something bad does not make them a bad person. She said, quote, all criminality is a choice, but some have more choice than others, end quote. And while I agree with her there, I would have to say that somebody like Ian Brady, somebody like Ted Bundy, somebody like Jeffrey Dahmer, somebody like Dennis Nilsen, they're bad people. They're bad people. They may not be purely evil, but they do bad things, and they are bad people. Because I have to ask myself the question, if people like Dennis Nilsen aren't bad people, then who is? Who's a bad person? We also have the viewpoint and the opinion of somebody named David Wilson. He was actually the governor of the prison while Nilsen was an inmate there. He's now a professor of criminology at Birmingham City University, and he actually met and talked with Dennis Nilsen several times. After David Wilson left the prison, he continued to receive letters from Nilsen, and David Wilson never believed that Dennis Nilsen was mentally insane. Wilson said, quote, "There was no evidence of mental illness. He was interested in power and control, and the ultimate form of expressing that was through taking people's lives," end quote. When David Wilson met Dennis, he was just 23 years old, he was a doctor of philosophy, and he was chilled to the bone to realize that he was in the same age group as Nilsen's victims, especially at the end of their first interview when he claims Nilsen leaned over the table towards him and asked, "Do you have to go?" which Wilson recalled were Dennis Nilsen's exact last words to his first victim. It's like some weird, morbid, dark version of "Baby, It's Cold Outside." I really can't stay, but baby, it's cold outside. I have to go away, but I haven't killed you yet. David Wilson said, quote, "I think he was playing with me and toying with me, and it was a long time ago, but I think he fancied me totally," end quote. David Wilson thinks that everyone wants to imagine serial killers like Hannibal Lecter, but Nilsen was not an extraordinary man. He wasn't a wine connoisseur. He wasn't an evil genius. He was completely ordinary and didn't stand out in any way. Wilson feels that Dennis Nilsen was just a bad man who enjoyed killing people in order to gain control over them, and he said, quote, "I think Nilsen went down to the West End to those bars with the intention to murder them. I think he was absolutely without a doubt evil. I think evil just came within him. He's just pure evil, a nasty man," end quote. In an article written by David Wilson in the Scotland Herald, he says, quote, "Part of my reluctance to accept what he claimed was that he would talk at me rather than with me. I was often merely a prop for him to have a conversation with himself, and I was only occasionally allowed or expected to ask a question. That was how controlling Nilsen liked to be, and I came to realize he worried that if he let down his guard for even a few seconds, it might expose him to some blunt truths about what he had done and who he was. Those truths could be avoided if he just controlled who it was who was doing the talking and therefore what was being said. He could give the appearance of wanting to discuss his serial murders, whilst at the same time subtly and sometimes not so subtly refusing to let anyone get a word in edgewise. His long-windedness might have given the impression that he wanted to talk, but it was all an act, for his goal was to silence discussion, in much the same way he throttled his victims. They, too, were mere props for his narcissistic, controlling, and murderous personality," end quote. And I think that Wilson nailed it here. I am really leaning towards David Wilson's interpretation of Dennis Nilsen because everything he said just makes sense to what we've learned about Dennis. This was a man who would ultimately have loved to live within an echo chamber that was filled with his own thoughts, political beliefs, and passions. He felt he was this incredibly astute, intelligent, special person that everyone else just did not understand. He was ahead of his time, right? A figure that, had he been born 50 years later, would have developed into an emotionally healthy and productive individual. Not only that, a successful person. He blamed all his shortcomings and all his failures on everyone and everything else. His parents, his siblings, his grandparents, Scotland, the army, the government, a rigid society, alcohol. The list goes on and on. He wanted connections and relationships to come easily. He had no interest in being questioned. He had no interest in being challenged. And if he met someone who did this, he didn't want to be around them. He wanted to be surrounded by passive people. He says the word passive all the time. You guys were making a joke about it in the comment sections from part 1 and 2. Take a shot every time Dennis Nilsen uses the word passive. He said it a lot. So he wanted to just be surrounded by these passive people who depended on him, like David Gallichan. That way they would defer to him for everything and be afraid to open their mouths lest their living situation be suddenly snatched away. He chose victims who were down on their luck, who would be grateful for a warm meal and a dry bed, who would allow him to ramble on about Margaret Thatcher for as long as he wanted because they were just grateful to be off the streets and, in their minds, safe for the first time in a long time, even though they were probably so much less safe in Dennis Nilsen's flat than they were any other place at any other time. In closing statements during the trial, the prosecution claimed that Nilsen killed for fun and then used great cunning to cover his tracks. Alan Green, the lead prosecutor, told the jury to ignore the defense when they claimed Dennis Nilsen could not help it, saying, quote, Dennis Nilsen was a clever man who was able to control his own actions. He was free to choose, and he did choose who to leave alone, and who to kill, and who to reprieve. And greater power hath no man than this, end quote. Essentially, Green was telling the jury that Nilsen had played God with his actions. He would prowl the streets, sit in pubs, run his greedy eyes over its inhabitants, and he would pick people to bring home simply to enjoy their company, and he would pick people to bring home simply to murder. At the end of the day, the ball was in his court. The decision of who lived and who died was ultimately up to him, and he held all the power in that regard. He was playing God. Green said that there was no denying Nilsen's brain was abnormal since he'd killed so many people. He killed, at least 15 people and attempted to kill 6 more. But that didn't mean that Nilsen was suffering from a diagnosable or treatable mental illness. We also have to touch on something that I think is pretty important in this case. Dennis Nilsen would have you believe that he and his victims shared quite a bit in common. They were on the outskirts of society. They didn't fit in anywhere. They would be judged for their vices and their lifestyles by those who considered themselves to be respectable and superior. And so basically Dennis is saying, me and my victims, we had that in common. We were outsiders. We were shunned by society. We were tossed to the side. Nobody cared about us. But I don't think that's true, because Dennis Nilsen would find himself face to face with law enforcement several times. Throughout the period of his murder spree, Nilsen attacked several men who would go on to escape. Some of them went to the police, some did not. But even those who found the courage to seek help were not given it. We talked about Carl Stoddard, Andrew Ho, and Douglas Stewart, but there were more. Dennis Nilsen was well known to the police, but when allegations against him did come up, they were dismissed. Law enforcement believed that Douglas Stewart and Nilsen had engaged in a homosexual lovers' tiff, and they didn't take Carl Stoddard seriously until after his attacker had been arrested. According to Detective Inspector Bob Brenton, one 10-year-old boy was attacked by Nilsen and escaped, but when the police went to talk to him to get him to go on the record, his parents refused. They refused because they didn't want their son to basically throw himself into the fray and be open for judgment. This boy had been in Dennis's flat. He had passed out, fallen asleep, and when he woke up, he was naked, and Dennis was advancing on him. So this poor kid escaped by jumping through the living room window, resulting in him having to get over 100 stitches. Now, this was not the attic apartment. It was his old flat. So I know you guys are going to ask, what? That's crazy. It was his old flat, so he was on the ground floor. So this little boy and his parents, they did go to the police and they reported it. But when it came down to pressing charges, going on the record, going to a trial, they didn't want to do that. So when Detective Brenton pursued this accusation and he went to this address, he was stunned to see his old buddy from the police force, Des. Detective Brenton asked Dennis, why was this little boy in your apartment, by the way, and why did he throw himself out of the window to get away from you? And Dennis responded, quote, well, I don't know why he did it, but if you've got the evidence, you can charge me. But if you don't, you have to let me go. Detective Brenton went on to say, quote, and that was our Dennis. He knew the law. I didn't say much to him other than, you have no idea how lucky you are. He must have thought he was the luckiest person in the world, end quote. But was it luck? Was it luck, really, Brenton? Or was it perception? Over the years, many have theorized that Nilsen's escaped victims were not taken seriously because they were gay. And while I believe that was certainly a factor, I also don't believe it was the only one. Because if the police thought that Dennis and Douglas Stewart were having a homosexual fight, they would have known, they would have assumed and figured that Dennis was gay as well. But they still took his side, even if they hadn't known him during his short time on the police force, because the police who handled that case, they were not familiar with Dennis. Dennis had the advantage over his victims. He wasn't like them at all. He had a job with the government, he lived in his own flat, he wore sweater vests, and looked like the most average guy in the history of the world. His victims, on the other hand, were sex workers, runaways, drug addicts, homeless. And in the end, those factors were going to garner them far less credibility than Dennis had, even if he was gay, at least upon first glance. On November 4th, 1985, Dennis Nilsen was sentenced to 8 life sentences after a jury rejected his plea of guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Now let's talk about Dennis Nilsen's mother, Betty, because we haven't heard from her in a while, and I'm always interested to hear the reaction from the family members of these serial killers. Because I have to believe, right, that no parent raises a child thinking that he or she will one day grow up to be a murderer. So I have to think that if that happens, the parents are always kind of surprised. When talking to the police about his grandfather, Andrew, Dennis called him a great hero and a protector. And he would describe this time in his childhood as his only time of contentment. Dennis said that his life would be empty until Andrew returned, when he was out for weeks at a time at sea, being a fisherman. His mother, Betty, even remembered taking him in to see Andrew's body and, telling him, your grandfather's in a better place. And Dennis said to her, well, if he's in a better place, why can't he take me with him? Because I want to be in that better place with him. Now, Betty did express regret for the confusion that Dennis experienced when seeing the dead body of his grandfather. And Catherine Devaney wrote, quote, I once read that Betty was in denial about her son, but I saw no evidence of that. She walked a remarkably difficult tightrope. She expressed abhorrence at her son's crimes, her deep hurt inside for those families he had destroyed, her incomprehension at what had happened, but she also expressed another emotion, a mother's enduring love for the son she had known and cared for, end quote. Betty wrote to Dennis all the time. I think she wrote him at first very often, and then after that once a month. But she wrote to Dennis after he went to prison, saying that she wanted to go and see him. She wanted to visit him, but he would not respond to her letters. Catherine Devaney even wrote letters to Nilsen asking if he would allow his mother to visit him or at least respond to her letters, but he would not. Betty once told the media, quote, people might think it's funny to carry on loving your son. It's not funny when he's your own, end quote. I can't even imagine. I always place myself in the shoes of the parents of the victims. Heartbreaking. I rarely place myself in the shoes of the parent of the murderer. And also heartbreaking, right? So heartbreaking because you love this child and you know that he's done bad things and you know that he took life, but you still love them.
How do you think Dennis was able to become involved in this kind of problem and then be able to live from day to day?
No, that's the bit I don't understand. I just don't understand how this could go on and nobody knowing anything. I mean, I don't know any but these 10 years of his life, and I can't see what was happening to him. Something must have happened to him, because it's not my Dennis that's doing it. Not the boy I knew that's doing these things. Yes, he's always my son. And that's why I want him to know that we're all concerned about him. And I just hope he'll get some help to cope with the situation he's in.
Now there's some scandal, okay? Because apparently Betty and her husband Adam, they were married for 42 years. But in 1996, she left him for a man named Bill Mason, who was 20 years younger than Betty was at the time. She was 77 years old at the time. So, I mean, he was not like super young. He was 57, but still. And her ex-husband Adam told reporters how heartbroken he was. But he blamed his stepson Dennis for Betty's impulsive change of heart, saying, quote, when I married Betty, she already had Dennis, but I became a real father to him. And when the stuff about the murders came out in the 80s, I gave her all the support any man could. Now she's left me for another man, completely out of the blue. It's a real slap in the face after all the time we've been together. But I think all those years of suffering because of Dennis have finally taken their toll. What she's done is so out of character. And Betty herself felt very differently about the situation, saying, quote, I only wish I had left my husband years ago. I haven't been happy in a long time, end quote. And it's sad, too, because apparently when Betty left Adam, their children just wouldn't talk to her anymore. After that, they kind of disowned her, so she kind of lost, all her kids. In May of 2018, Dennis Nilsen, who was serving his sentence at a prison in Sutton, began complaining about severe stomach pains. So he was taken to the hospital where it was discovered that he'd suffered from a ruptured aortic aneurysm in his stomach. He had surgery, the aneurysm was repaired, but he developed a blood clot as a result of the surgery and died 2 days later on May 12, 2018, after serving only 34 years of a life sentence. Nilsen had told his next of kin that he wanted to be cremated and then have his ashes spread at the bottom of the garden in the backyard of his Melrose Avenue apartment, the place that he had set all those bonfires to burn the bodies of his victims. He was cremated, but his second request was not honored. His next of kin, a man named Mark Austin, said, quote, "I thought it was an insult. When the time comes, I'm probably going to scatter his ashes in the sea in Fraserburgh," end quote. "I am demonic. I am strong and weak. I am the harbinger of death. I am not a monster. I am a man." Those were words that Dennis Nilsen wrote. While he was in prison, Nilsen penned his own autobiography using a tape recorder to capture his words as they occurred to him. He talked about how bad the prison food was, he talked about his crimes, and he smoked a lot of weed. One Christmas, he recorded himself saying, quote, "What a way to spend Christmas. Because it's the festive season, I think I should have a magic cigarette. Let's have a wee spot of magic. Oh God, I'm stoned as a bat here. Ah, I've got the keyboard out in front of me. Before me is a small, portable mini keyboard of 1980s vintage. Here, in this splendid and accustomed isolation, I can use this audio brush to paint all the colored hues of my emotions. I reach out to the board, and my hands are shaking slightly," end quote. So it was a keyboard, like a music keyboard, not a computer keyboard. I kind of see him in prison, just sitting in his underwear. He's got one of those like harmonica things on, it goes on your head and then the harmonica just goes around to your mouth so you don't have to hold it. And he's like playing the keyboard and like, playing the harmonica. And then every so often he'll stop and then say something into the recorder, something like super poetic and dramatic and flowery. And then he'll just go back. But I'm sure it didn't happen that way. Dennis Nilsen also took pictures of himself in prison and he complained about how it was unfair. Not that he had killed people, but that he had done the right thing and confessed to the police and they'd used his words against him, and the media had used his words to turn him into a monster. He said, quote, "A clearly prejudiced picture had been allowed to form in the public's mind even before I was charged with any offense, giving the media full latitude to milk their property. This allowed the images of a monstrosity to take full flight, to whet the profitable public imagination. I am a man, not a monster. Awkward, isn't it?" End quote. So he didn't feel remorse. And he was still as delusional as ever. Because listen, I'm not a fan of the media, and I do know that they print things specifically for a narrative, but they didn't print anything that was a lie. They printed what he said. He gave them all the ammo. He did tell everything to the police. He willingly told everything to the police, even after he was arrested, even after they said, your words can be used against you and you want a lawyer. He was like, "Nah, fam, let's just talk. Let's sit down and talk about this." He did that, and the media just printed it. So no, it's not awkward, dude. He's like, "Oh, I'm a man, not a monster." Awkward, isn't it? Like everyone's proved wrong when we see you in your jail cell with your keyboard, in your underwear, and we're like, "Oh, it's just a normal dude. He's not a monster. I feel so awkward now." No, you still killed a bunch of people. You're still a monster. However, I will say, his writings, his words, his colored and hued emotions, they got me thinking and asking myself the question, does a monster know that they are a monster? Does the monster have the level of self-awareness it takes to acknowledge the truth about oneself? And I have to admit that I tend to have a very jaded view of humanity as a whole, and I don't trust anyone. The more that people get into groups, the less I trust them. So for instance, take a one-on-one discussion. A one-on-one discussion between two people who have very differing viewpoints can go incredibly productively. Because if somebody who doesn't think the same way as you do asks you a question, you have time to contemplate. You have time to think about it and give a thoughtful response. But when you're in a group, if there's 10 or 12 people in a room and half the people think one way and half the people think the other, it just turns into everyone screaming at each other because nobody thinks that they're going to have a chance for their words to be heard. So they feel like they have to constantly shout over one another. And that leads, spoiler alert, nowhere, not even nowhere good, just nowhere at all. It's just everyone's yelling. You can't even hear anyone and you have no idea where they stand or if anything that they're saying is actually good or true or productive. So I tend to not trust groups of people. However, on an individual basis, I am more forgiving. And I do believe that most people who do bad things are sometimes doing these bad things, but thinking they're doing the right thing. An article from Psychology Today stated this very idea really concisely, writing, quote, "In a conflict, each side sees itself as good and justified, and they see the enemy as evil. In fact, you can argue that the only real thing that differentiates a protagonist from an antagonist is that the author is taking the protagonist's side and showing his or her justifications rather than the justifications of the antagonist," end quote. The face of evil is no one's face and everyone's face, right? People who do evil things often justify doing these things by convincing themselves that their actions are moral. But morality can be a very subjective thing and can mean something different depending on the person. There are 4 different ways that people do this. One is by redefining the behavior or changing the perspective so that this behavior seems less bad. Most people agree that killing is wrong, but if you're killing someone that you consider to be evil, someone who's done evil things, you've rationalized to yourself that this person is evil, so therefore removing them from the equation is not really that bad. Take, for example, Dexter. Dexter kills people, but he only kills bad people, and that is how he justifies it to himself. But as we see, if you've watched Dexter, you know that this gets very muddy, that it's not really black and white, there's a lot of gray areas. This also calls to mind the baby Hitler ethical dilemma. If you could go back in time and kill Hitler as a baby to save all of those people, would you? Would you kill an innocent baby who had committed no acts of wrongdoing yet simply because you know what's going to happen in the future? Most people say that they would. Arguably, this is a very evil act, murdering an innocent baby. Yet, so many are on board with it. Personally, when I'm presented with the baby Hitler ethical drama, I say I would not be able to do that. I don't think I could. Nope, I wouldn't be able to do it. I would steal that baby, man. I would kidnap baby Hitler. I would take him out of Germany, and I would raise him as my own, and I would love him, and I would give him so much kindness, and I would read to him all the greats and make him so smart, not just mentally, but emotionally. And I think that would make all the difference. Because that baby Hitler was not born evil. Baby Hitler was not born to become what he became. But that's just my opinion. So reframing the situation, I would say that Dennis Nilsen did this often. He would say that he was killing his victims because he was saving them from their lives and from themselves. They were no good. The world would be better off without them. He justified his actions by trying to find some good thread in there, something that tied his behavior to something that was moral. Another approach to this is to disregard or distort the consequences of the behavior. If Dennis Nilsen didn't think about the pain he was causing, then he wouldn't have to experience the negative and uncomfortable emotion of guilt. Nilsen also dehumanized and blamed the victims, which is the third approach. He didn't even remember the names of most of the men he had killed. He didn't bother to learn anything about them or their lives. He didn't care about them. He didn't care who they were. He didn't care who was going to miss them. At least he didn't care about them as living men. But when they were dead, that's when he became attached to them. He depersonalized them. He turned them into objects. The fourth and final method is to displace or diffuse responsibility. Rather than taking personal responsibility and accountability for your actions, you blame a larger group or an organization. So for instance, I didn't kill all those people. I was just following orders. Or in Dennis Nilsen's case, I did kill those people, but it's society's fault. Society tossed them aside, trampled all over them, left them broken shells who cannot contribute to the world in any meaningful or productive way, and it's not my fault that I have to clean up the mess that society created. I think we can all agree that Dennis Nilsen killed because he wanted to, and that all the excuses he made after were just that, excuses, justifications that sounded better than saying, I killed them because I wanted to and because I could. And at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if someone believes what they were doing was good if it is objectively evil. We may have gray areas for things like theft, but for me, there's no gray area when it comes to taking the life of another human being. There are things that are truly in this world black and white. Things like murder. It's not good ever. It's bad. If you murder an innocent person, it's bad. Some might argue if you murder a non-innocent person, it's bad. But either way, It's bad. I want to address something that has been coming up in the comment section for the first 2 videos because I think it's important not only to clarify where I'm coming from, but to also maybe give you another layer of perspective and see if the narrative changes, if the conversation changes a little bit. Now, when I was talking about Dennis Nilsen and his grandfather Andrew, and when I said personally I don't believe that this happened to Dennis Nilsen, I think it was a lie to make himself look more relatable, to make himself look more sympathetic. Most of the people who studied his life also agree with me, but there was people who were saying, it probably happened. Well, we don't know what happened, right? And what I'm not willing to do is take Andrew White, a man who's dead and can't defend himself, a man who may have lived a completely moral life and is now being smeared. I'm not going to just go ahead and say he's guilty. And a lot of people used this as a reason of why they thought Dennis was being honest. They said kids don't make this stuff up. I agree with you. I do agree with you, although that's also a generalization, and I'm very uncomfortable with generalizations because, as we know, kids have made up this stuff before, but it's usually not on a one-on-one basis. They'll be coached to do it. There's a narrative, but they have made this stuff up or told lies that they were told to tell. That is the exception, not the rule. So I agree with you there. But if you're going to use that as a reason why you believe Dennis, you have to realize and recognize that Dennis did not say this stuff when he was a kid. In fact, nobody heard anything about it until after he was arrested for the murders of multiple people. Okay? No one heard anything about it. He never said this to any of his boyfriends. David Gallichan, who lived with him, who I guess you could arguably say was the closest person to him. He never said it to any of his siblings, no friends, nobody. He never said it to anybody. Does that mean it didn't happen? No, of course not. What it does mean is, in my opinion, it's less likely that it happened because little Dennis wasn't saying this to people. It was big Dennis after he'd been arrested for murder, and he was trying to make his murder seem justified, which he's done a million times in a million different ways. And to me, this was just another way that he was trying to justify it, because not one living person has ever heard this before he was arrested. So it was actually adult serial killer Dennis Nilsen who said these things. So that's where I'll leave you. Let me know what you guys think about this case in the comment sections. Let me know what you think. Comment section, there's only one of them last time I checked. Let me know what you think about Dennis. Let me know what you think about all of these different mental health professionals' perspectives, what they think about him. I really do think that Dennis Nilsen at the end of the day was about control. He felt like crap about himself. He realized that he wasn't actually interesting enough or kind enough or giving enough for anybody to want to stay around for an extended period of time. So he ended up just trying to figure out the best way to control people and force them to do what he wanted. And killing them was his best way, I suppose. That's just my take on it. But let me know what you guys think. Thank you so much for being here for me. Thank you so much for sticking with me through another Serial Killers series. I will be back soon. I think we have another couple coffee and crimes. So right now I'm recording this on Monday, November 22nd. After I finish recording this, I have to go up and finish working on the podcast because Derek and I are recording a podcast tonight. And then tomorrow I'm working on a coffee and crime time. So there will be, I believe, just one more video for this month because Thanksgiving is coming up and I want to spend a couple of days with my family and, do holiday things and eat turkey, definitely lots of mashed potatoes. So I hope every one of you has an amazing holiday. If you celebrate Thanksgiving, if you don't, I still hope you have an amazing time. Don't drink too much. I'm talking to myself more than you guys. So I'm not good at linking. But have an amazing holiday. Spend time with your family. Spend time with your friends. Spend time with the people who mean the most to you because this world is going bananas. I just saw this terrible story about something that happened in Wisconsin, a Christmas parade, bunch of kids, families, just some SUV just plowed through it, killed some people, injured more. It's just gross and disgusting. And I'm so sad to think that there are going to be families going into Thanksgiving who are dealing with this on top of everything else that the world has thrown at us. So I'm thinking of them, and I hope that all of us who luckily haven't gone through something like this just really take the time this holiday season, to be with our families and love them and our friends and, just give all the positivity and love we can to the humans around us because that is what everyone needs right now. Thank you so much for being here. Stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe, and I'll see you very soon. Bye.
straight down. And that river runs deep, the mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery. They're coming back from the grave, calling out my name, better say a Hail Mary. Well, you don't know how deep it goes until it's getting you slowly. And so you got to let it go. I got blood on the strings.